This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Washington University is attempting to take steps to reconcile the university's ties to slavery, genocide, and discrimination. In a moment, we'll hear from the inaugural chair of the new Naming Review Board. That group is responsible for evaluating whether buildings, spaces, scholarships, and other university features should be renamed or receive greater historical context. But before that, we want to revisit STLPR reporter and newscaster Marissa Ann Lewis-Thompson's 2021 conversation about a Washington University co-founder's complicated past. Here's Marissa Ann.
For many years, Washington University has portrayed one of its co-founders as an abolitionist, someone who wanted to abolish slavery. William Greenleaf Eliot's role in founding the school is undeniable, but his legacy and views on slavery are complicated. In many ways, he was a man of his times, but the notion that he was an abolitionist is simply not true. A few years ago, a team of WashU students and faculty came together to rethink Eliot's legacy and ties to the institution of slavery. In 2021, I spoke with Ivor Bernstein, a professor of history and African American studies at WashU. He co-taught a course called Rethinking WashU's Relationship to Enslavement, Past, Present, and Future. I also talked with then WashU history student and now graduate Nkemjika Imanike. She was a teaching assistant for the course and was one of several students who co-authored an article in the school's independent student newspaper, Student Life, titled WashU's Founder Was Not an Abolitionist. Who was William Greenleaf Eliot? I first asked Ivor Bernstein about what led to the conclusion that not only was Eliot not an abolitionist, but that Eliot himself did not even identify with being one.
Well, thanks, Marissa. And those key documents that have allowed this amazing team of students to publish this article on William Greenleaf Eliot's views are really hiding in plain sight. And you only have to read about 15 minutes into the Eliot letters and his published articles, his sermons, to realize that not only was he not an abolitionist, he was vehemently opposed to abolitionism and saw the abolitionists as a great threat to the sorts of plans he wanted to develop for St. Louis and, by extension, Washington University.
Then where did this narrative that he was an abolitionist even come from, and why did it even stick?
That's such a great question. Looking at the label from the present day, it really does seem that having that label serves some obvious sort of functions. It makes Eliot a sort of a founding father you can be proud of Washington University. It's a simple label, and it seems to put him on the side of morality and the angels. So there's no question that the branding of the university as a kind of progressive enterprise, which of course in so many ways it is, but to have Eliot's abolitionist imprimatur attached to that has been something that the university has been happy to have. But the question of when over the last 100 years, the mythology, if you will, of Eliot as an abolitionist came about is something that I think is going to be a subject of future research.
And it is quite ironic because he was definitely not a fan of the abolitionist movement. Your research found that Eliot thought of abolitionists as radicals and even described them at a point as being abolition Pharisees. That essentially, would be fine with burning the country down to get their views across. And Nkemjika, is there a clear reason why he felt so strongly opposed to abolitionists in comparison to other groups?
Yeah, I think Eliot, kind of as Ivor mentioned, was in the process of building a city, building an institution. He was one of few wealthy men at the time who were very influential in sort of creating what St. Louis would be. They were seeking to put St. Louis on the map. And I think he saw abolitionists and sort of this idea of these radical Northerners who didn't understand what the Missouri life was about and the St. Louis life was about, kind of imposing these really pretentious, quote unquote, views about what Black liberation looked like in St. Louis. He was very concerned with keeping the peace, staying moderate. He wasn't really in the interest of shaking things up, of revolutionizing what freedom would look like. And that's what abolitionism was truly about. It was about developing what Black freedom could look like, specifically in America. And he was very much of the impression that that would not happen overnight, that shouldn't happen overnight. And if it did, it would tear down the efforts he and his colleagues have put into building St. Louis.
And to that point, in the run-up to the Civil War, there were a lot of conversations about the emancipation of enslaved Black people. Ivor, can you explain what it meant to be an abolitionist at that time and what it meant to support colonization instead?
To be an abolitionist in the 1830s, say in 1834, when William Greenleaf Eliot steps off the riverboat and arrives in St. Louis from the Northeast, was to be part of an embattled minority. Abolitionists are routinely subject to violent attacks, both rhetorical and physical. The lynching of Francis McIntosh, which is a critically important event in St. Louis history, happens not long after Eliot arrives. And one of the reasons why Eliot, as the students have so fantastically, so beautifully revealed in their article, one of the reasons why Eliot is so opposed to any sympathy at all, any human empathy for Francis McIntosh, is because he believes that McIntosh either was an abolitionist, McIntosh a free Black man, mixed-race American citizen of Philadelphia who is arriving on a boat in St. Louis, and Eliot fervently believes that McIntosh deserves the lynching, that McIntosh deserves it because he is an abolitionist or connected to abolitionists somehow.
Can you talk a little bit more about colonization? Can you describe to me what that looked like?
Part of what made it credible is, images of the Exodus in the Old Testament, the notion that large groups of people could somehow find freedom through long migrations. Part of what made it credible was this pessimism that Nkemjika was talking about, really, which is simply that, a fear that the race problem, as Eliot would have put it, was more than America could handle, that the social order simply would fracture, and that Black freedom and Black people's freedom would best be realized outside the confines of a United States that would be torn apart by this struggle. So that was a pessimistic view, very different from grassroots Black opinion and from the abolitionist perspective.
So as you mentioned, Eliot supported the idea of colonization, which, essentially meant sending free Black people to a colonized Liberia. And some of his comments about where Black people fit in U.S. society are really racist. In a speech to the St. Louis Young Men's Colonization Society, he said, quote, "To place Black people upon an equal footing to whites, to give them equal political, social, and civil privileges with the whites is quite an impractical thing in our day and probably will be impracticable for many generations to come, if not forever." And Nkemjika, can you walk me through the process of establishing a complete picture of Eliot that deviates from the narrative that has been there for a while?
Yeah, I think that's the big question of this article. Like, who is Eliot truly? And I think he was someone in speeches, in writings, in newspaper clippings, it would always be, regardless of his own beliefs, he took the stance because it was impractical, because he didn't think that it was right to take a strictly abolitionist stance. But at some point, you kind of have to realize that is his personal belief, right? Like, you can no longer separate from, like, regardless of what he thinks, like, this is the stance that he took and this is what he said, because he's saying what he believes. And I think to paint a complete picture of Eliot is to kind of recognize that, his roots in colonization, his writing of the story of Archer Alexander are all rooted in this sort of paternalism and patronizing view of Black people. He sees himself as I think the term white savior is a really good word, but he sees himself as this person who knows best. He is educated. He's a religious leader. He's a philanthropist. He doesn't trust that Black people know what their own freedom is. He doesn't trust that Black people know what their own liberation could look like. And he's a firm believer that whatever that would look like, that's not going to happen in America, and that any effort towards that is frivolous. It's pointless.
Did Eliot ever own any enslaved people?
The data that we've had, we did some research. We also have a student, Charlie Fallon, who in his research of the 1840 census, I believe, listed a W.G. Eliot as owning one enslaved person. There are other documents that show that Eliot had bought an enslaved person with the intention of freeing them, but there's not really any documentation of what happens to that enslaved person after he had bought them. So from what we know, he had owned at least one or two enslaved people he had bought with the purpose of freeing them.
So Eliot was also a Unitarian minister. The church took a strong stance against slavery, and Eliot was opposed to the church drawing the line in the sand. He avoided talking about it from the pulpit, and he even resigned from a leadership role in the church. And yet, he published an entire story about Archer Alexander, a Black man who fought for his freedom. With this information in Kimjika, how did that change the interpretation of his relationship with Archer Alexander?
I think, understanding all that background of where he kind of was on the spectrum of Unitarian ministers and their anti-slavery stances, just from speaking with the First Unitarian Church and also just doing a bit of research about Unitarianism in the 1800s and how many of them were, in fact, radical abolitionists. I think it kind of put into perspective that what Eliot was writing truly was a product of his time in St. Louis. I think it kind of put into perspective that he was conservative even for his time, even for his community of people, even for his religious community. He was very conservative in his beliefs of slavery. And I think thinking of that in terms of the Archer Alexander story, I think he just views Archer Alexander again as just the exception. He doesn't foresee abolitionism as the next step.
What's been your biggest takeaway from the work that you've done in this class?
My biggest takeaway from, this project, being able to truly understand the impacts of a historical research experience, I think is really important, I think, for me to see, and I think for many other people to see who are in the humanities, who are in research. And I think the big question we get is, why does this matter? And this is why it matters, because this history, as an institution, we act on precedent. Everyone acts on precedent. The past is directly responsible for how we conduct ourselves right now. And this history of Eliot, of our founders, and their, nuanced, often very violent relationship with enslavement is an important history to kind of take back when considering who is WashU for.
That's Nkemjika Emenike talking with STLPR's Marissa Ann Lewis Thompson in 2021. Emenike was then a WashU history student and teaching assistant for a course examining the university's ties to slavery. In that 2021 conversation, Emenike, who has since graduated, joined Professor Ivor Bernstein. Marissa Ann noted that a few years ago, WashU, under Chancellor Andrew Martin's leadership, joined dozens of colleges and universities that were studying their ties to slavery. The undergraduate course, Rethinking WashU's Relationship to Enslavement, Past, Present, and Future, was part of that effort. Marissa Ann asked Emenike and Bernstein about that support.
I think it is something to be applauded. Chancellor Martin is taking a extremely valuable and bold position when he endorses this kind of research and this kind of searching self-examination of the university. That said, I don't think self-congratulation, and I don't think that's what he's involved in, perhaps now just the opposite, but self-congratulation is and has been the usual sort of branding, the mode of presentation of not just Washington universities, but many of the universities who are now involved in this kind of work. And what I love about the students' research is that it presents itself in a question-asking mode, which is very different from self-congratulation.
Yeah, I think it's necessary work, right? Like and I don't say this to contradict Ivor, but I don't see any congratulations for an institution researching the ways in which it's contributed to the harm of the people in its community. That's necessary work. That's work that needs to be done. That's work that should have been done. And so I'm glad it's being done now, and I'm glad with the students that I've been working with and the professors I've been working with, that it's being done by people who truly care and who are taking efforts to really handle this information as delicately, but also at the same time as aggressively as possible. Like looking at this information, being understanding of it, but then asking the hard, aggressive questions as to, why? Like, why is this happening? How has our university contributed to different types of harm? I think it's a really important question.
How do you hope the university and the St. Louis region view Eliot going forward?
Well, I hope they regard Eliot as the beginning of a conversation rather than the end of a conversation. So often he has been regarded as a kind of self-evident fact. And I think our region has benefited to think that it has this, abolitionist hero that somehow compensates for Missouri as a slave state and St. Louis as a slavery city. It's been an unearned pride about Eliot, which should be transformed into a nuanced and complex understanding of Eliot that opens up questions and doesn't close them off. Eliot is not a brand. He's a complex historical figure rooted in a troubling and still present reality.
What about you and Kimchika?
I think a big thing for me is just understanding that, history and people, they're not one-dimensional. And we know that when we think about things in the present day and we think about people in our own lives, but suddenly when we think about people in history and people in the 1800s, we don't think about all the nuances and all the different experiences that they have that are making up the decisions that they make. And that's not to excuse what Eliot has done, but rather to say that, he is at the end of the day a product of many different forms of enforcing, white supremacy, oppression. I think I would just like the university to understand that, it's not that Eliot was a good guy, bad guy. It's that Eliot was very, very complex. And that, and understanding what that means for an institution that was founded in some of the country's most stark periods of racial violence and racial reckoning. What does that mean? So I think just kind of taking into the full context of, Eliot wasn't just this philanthropist who built up all these institutions in St. Louis, but he also had some very problematic, at best, views of where Black people who made up a good amount of the city, what their place would be in St. Louis.
Again, that's Nkemjika Emenike talking with STLPR's Marissa Ann Lewis-Thompson in 2021. Emenike graduated last year, but was, then, a WashU history student and teaching assistant for a course that examined the university's ties to slavery. History and African American Studies professor Ivor Bernstein also joined that conversation. When we come back, Marissa Ann joins me to talk about the latest developments in this story.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
Let's get back to our discussion about Washington University and how the school is grappling with its ties to slavery and other problematic facets of American history. In just a bit, we'll hear STLPR newscaster and reporter Marissa Ann Lewis-Thompson's conversation with the inaugural chair of the board that will now consider how to reconcile the university's past. But before that, Marissa Ann joins me now. Marissa Ann, you've been following this story for the last several years. What is it that's kept your interest in it?
Well, the initial revelation about the university's co-founder, William Greenleaf Eliot, in the Student Life article grabbed my attention. The idea that he was an abolitionist was always this point of pride for people I've interviewed over the years. And then to learn that it was all a tall tale exposed by a group of WashU students and faculty is something that I was not expecting. But once the hype died down, I did wonder what would accountability look like in terms of atonement? And it's unclear what that will look like now, of course, but this naming review board on a basic level is providing an opportunity for members of the WashU community to further hold the institution accountable.
Now, before we get to that naming board, Washington University is not the only school dealing with these issues. How is it that some other schools are dealing with them?
So to start out, WashU's name review board stems from an initiative from Chancellor Andrew Martin's office last January, and that ultimately birthed this board. Outside of WashU, though, University of California, Berkeley, or UC Berkeley, Princeton, Ohio State, and Johns Hopkins University are just some of the schools that have opted to have their own versions of a name review board. Others, like UNC Chapel Hill, created a name removal policy.
And are these schools then, are they farther along in their processes or in pretty much the same boat WashU is?
I think it's important to say for all of these schools, the process does take time. In the case of UNC Chapel Hill, they renamed one of its residence halls after the university's first Black faculty member, Hortense McClinton. And fun fact, she's still with us. She'll be 106 this year.
Wow.
I know, right? Johns Hopkins University's name review board made its first denaming recommendation last October for an endowed professorship, and that came about 2 years after they established their board. For UC Berkeley, they ultimately decided to remove the names from several buildings. But much like WashU, Ohio State, not much has happened yet.
Now, we're about to hear the interview that you had with the inaugural chair of the Naming Review Board at Washington University. But you also sought to talk with Chancellor Andrew Martin about the effort. Marissa Ann, what did that yield? And how was that request received or handled?
In short, a spokesperson for the university said that the chancellor would not be giving interviews on the story, and a statement was not provided.
Was that any surprise to you?
A little bit, because this is a positive initiative, right? And this was something that they were seeking community support on, and it was just somewhat surprising that a request for an interview was just not well received. So, yeah, it was kind of surprising because it seemed like it would be something that we want to talk about. But, hey, you never know.
Right. Well, Marissa Ann, you mentioned reporting from Student Life, and that's the independent student newspaper at WashU. And they had a top administrator talk with them. What was it that administrator added?
Yeah, so they were able to speak with Rebecca Brown, the Vice Chancellor for Strategic Initiatives and University Governance, and she essentially outlined the origin story for how the board came to be, but nothing else really.
Do you have any sense of how students and community members are feeling about this naming board coming together and what they think about this particular effort, which is to rename buildings and positions?
Well, I can't speak to that specifically, but what I can say is that Student Life article did bring about a level of clarity about its co-founder that was never quite there. As I mentioned earlier, there was this notion that William Greenleaf Eliot, was this abolitionist and that everything was great. And then in reality, that was not the case. And what's been pretty much made clear is that his name will come up in this conversation. There's no way around it. And his name is all over that university in a physical sense, right? There are a number of things named after him, including the William Greenleaf Eliot Residential College. Underneath the Brookings Archway, there's a large plaque in his honor. And of course, there is the William Greenleaf Eliot Society with nearly 10,000 members across the globe. And it brought in a little more than $28 million in unrestricted gifts in fiscal year 2022 and 2023. So it'll really be interesting to see what accountability will look like in the years to come.
And that money has come in after revelations have been made about Eliot's positions on slavery, namely that they were not against it. That has not affected how people have made decisions about giving.
On the surface, no. And I do want to say that there is the possibility that they may not know about this, about his true legacy. So that is something to be mindful of in this conversation, because obviously it took all of us to learn roughly 3 years ago now that the whole abolitionist storyline was not it at all.
Marissa Ann, thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you so much for having me, Elaine.
Now, let's get to the conversation you had with Peter Castor. He's a professor of history and American culture studies at WashU and is the inaugural chair of the Naming Review Board. Marissa Ann first asked him what led to the creation of the board.
The board is the result of some work by a committee last year, and I was a member of that committee, and it was the chancellor himself, Andrew Martin, who called for the creation of that, because one thing he knew was that universities have a responsibility to understand their own history and to have processes in place to deal with that. And of course, one thing we know is that many universities have also been grappling with this. There are a variety of universities where people have called for buildings or statues or other items to be renamed, to be removed, to have just the names entirely removed. And so last year, the chancellor created a committee to answer the question, what was WashU going to do about this?
I want to get into this. What buildings and scholarships, amongst so many other things, have been identified prior to the creation of this board as having ties to individuals with problematic legacies?
First thing I'll say is I think I'm going to give you a disappointing answer. That's not a list I can really give you. And I think the answer to that, the reason that is the case, really gets to the core of what the Naming Review Board does. It is not our job to proactively identify, the term we use is named features, because we want to define this broadly. That can be buildings, fellowships, scholarships, professorships. It isn't our job to go out and identify them, because we are also an adjudicatory board. Our job is to make decisions about these. And so the way we are designed is that is what we focus on. We focus on making decisions that others present to us. And any member of the university community, not just faculty like me, faculty, staff, students, folks who are not employed or attending WashU, but who live around WashU, all of them are welcome to submit a request through our website to say, I have a question or an issue, or I want to challenge this name. And our job is to review those once they come in.
So as you mentioned, people in the WashU community will have the opportunity to submit online the names of buildings, scholarships, professorships, lectureships, to name a few, that should be considered for review. What are the standards that have to be met in order for that review to happen?
First, our foundational principles were that the university's teaching, learning, and patient care objectives are fundamentally enhanced by fostering diversity and inclusion throughout its campus, and that the strongest reason to contextualize or remove a name is if the individual or entity in question supported or engaged in slavery, genocide, or discrimination based on characteristics such as race, gender, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, disability, socioeconomic status, or age. Renaming or other forms of contextualization may also be appropriate when the individual or entity at issue is directly associated with significant criminal activity or other destructive behavior for broad societal concerns. So those principles really governed this and govern our work.
So what happens after the board receives a submission in terms of action? Like, will buildings, et cetera, be renamed immediately, or will this be a long process?
We receive a report through our website. And the first thing that happens is we review it for completeness. And once all of the information is complete, it then goes to the naming review board for what's called a formal review. And our goal is to review these as quickly and as thoroughly as possible. And those two goals are not always the same. Sometimes you need more time to do something thoroughly. Some of these, I think, might be cases that we could, some I imagine might be quicker than others. We do not in our guiding document specify how long each step is going to take, but we will inform the person who has sent the submission at each stage what the status of this is. We've received this, it's moving on to the naming review board for consideration. We send recommendations to the chancellor. The chancellor now is Andrew Martin. He receives those recommendations. He then submits them to the chair of our board of trustees for a final review. And only after it's gone through, I would say, those 4 steps, only then is any decision finalized. And the decisions could range. The decision might be that a request does not merit a change of any kind. It might be that a submission merits renaming something. It might be that the decision is to preserve the name, but to perhaps include some text that explains this person and really identifies those issues, or uses any one of a number of other steps. There are a variety of ways that organizations around the country have sought to contextualize problematic names.
There have been efforts to further explore WashU's ties to the institution of slavery. In 2021, the university joined more than 80 colleges and universities to explore that connection. And through that initiative, a group of WashU students and professors released research that detailed WashU's co-founder was not an abolitionist and owned enslaved people. How will this effort build on the work that's already been established?
What I would simply say is that their work, which has been extraordinary historical research, is part of what equips us for this process. So if WashU and slavery, as you said, they found information about the university's founder. We had no process in place for anybody to raise that as an issue or to discuss what the university might do with a situation like that. The purpose of the naming review board is to actually create a structure that people can use to tell them, if you want to raise a question, if you want to raise a concern, most specifically, if you want to make a submission to have the university reconsider what a feature is named for, you now have a way to do that.
What I want to get to next is, who will make up this board and how long will it be in effect? Because, you already said that, there isn't a specific timeline per se as to how long each step in the process will go. But are we talking about this will be a board that will exist a decade from now?
The board does not have an expiration date. I want to be very clear about that. This is now a standing organization of the university, and its work continues. So it's really just starting now, of course, but I want to be clear, this was not established as a short-term organization. Members of the board serve for finite terms, several years, after which they rotate off and other people rotate in. So what was critically important to us is that the board have representation from various constituencies at the university. Faculty, students, both undergraduate and graduate. There are university administrators and there's university staff, which is very important as well. Often people talk about faculty and students, but university employees include large numbers of staff personnel who work at the university for years and make just extraordinary contributions to the university.
As the inaugural chair of this board, what do you hope to accomplish?
First and foremost, I want to do an effective job in this role. We have a large group of people who come at this from a variety of backgrounds. That's the strength of this board. And my first responsibility is to make certain this group comes together and works in a manner that is collegial and respectful. We have to deal with some messy and difficult questions. And I want that consideration. At the end of any consideration, I want people to emerge from that believing and knowing that people respected their opinions, that they were able to say what they believed, and that we had a thorough, honest, and transparent conversation. So that is my goal for the body itself. And whether that person is a senior faculty member like me, or a 21-year-old college junior, or someone who's been serving in a staff role for 30 years, I want them to all have that experience. That is my first order of business for the board itself. For the board's operations, I want to make certain that we live up to our mandate, that when somebody sends a submission, we handle that submission in a manner that preserves the confidentiality of the board, but is still appropriately transparent with the person who makes that submission. We will keep them informed as this proceeds. When the whole process is completed, that person will know the decision. It doesn't mean that everybody will be happy with every decision. No organization works that way. But I want the people that if people do make submissions, I want them to be treated respectfully and with transparency. The other thing is, I want people to know about the board. This was not created to prevent consideration of these questions. The very reason I'm talking with you, the reason you know about this, the reason that we've had coverage of it in our university publications, the reason we circulated an announcement inviting people to apply for the at-large positions is we wanted people at the university and in the university community to know that this body exists and that the university is committed to tackling these difficult and complex questions.
Today's episode was produced by Marissa Ann Lewis-Thompson and our executive producer, Alex Hoyer.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations. And leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thanks.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.